Yes, absolutely fine. Hello, good evening and good afternoon to everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to be here and to be introducing the session on Accessibility Go, a guide to action that was actually co-developed by World Blind Union and CBM Global. So today with me, I have my colleague and friend Cathy Aljoubeh, Senior Advisor on Inclusive Development and Capacity Development Lead at CBM Global Disability Inclusion. Hello, Cathy. Can you hear us?
Yes, thanks, Ben. Thanks for the introduction. Glad to be here with World Blind Union at the World Blindness Summit.
Hi, Cathy. Yeah, it's actually great. And I will be with Cathy moderating the session. My name is Benjamin Dard, and I'm working with World Blind Union as the Senior Advisor for Inclusive and Accessible Urban Development. Welcome to everyone. And for the purpose of the session, we would just like to remind everyone that the session is being recorded and we'll assume consent for all of those who are currently not deciding to stay on. Quick look at the session outline for today. We'll start by doing a quick presentation of the guide and just go through the quick business case for accessibility. And that would be a kind of just giving you just the basic information so that then we can start engaging into the sharing learning and experiences with the panelists and speakers that are here today, and the idea is really to discuss and learn from other practitioners, who have been working on accessibility and who have been contributing to the development and the use of this guide. And for that, we'll have our colleague Enoch Bani from World Blind Union that will be speaking around PDF as an accessible medium. We will also welcome Al-Hadi Abdallah and Rosario Galarza from the International Disability Alliance that will actually explain some of the complexities around the translation and how to not lose meaning of or CRPD compliance when we translate guidance such as the Accessibility Go guide. Then we will move with Marion Steff, and she's working for the European Disability Forum, and she will really take us through the key learnings around using the self-assessment tools that are part of the guide as well. And we will also talk and learn from Lourdes Gonzalez Perea from the ONCE Foundation that will also explain a little bit about her work on accessibility and how the guide could actually support the existing work with ONCE Foundation. Ultimately, we'll take a look at the next steps and way forward, and we'll have further discussion with Cathy, Al-Hadi, and Rosario around moving accessibility forward at the regional level, and what does it imply in terms of rolling out the guide and working with World Blind Union and also the Bridge alumni as part of the Bridge CRPD and Sustainable Development Goal initiative. And we will be finishing the session with some question and closing remark. And while I will be in charge of the PowerPoint during that session, my colleague Cathy will also look at the Q&A and the chat box to actually see if we have questions coming up, and we'll make sure we're going to address them as we go forward. So now we would like to start just by explaining the rationale around why this guide actually and why now.
Thanks, Ben. And why this guide? Why now? For CBM Global, accessibility is not just a nice to have, it's critical. It's a precondition, it's a principle of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. And it's a must-have obligation for us. It's the most basic precondition to ensure the right to equal participation and inclusion of all persons with disabilities in all areas of life, be that from social, economic, cultural, political. So for CBM Global, we realized that we can't move forward on any aspect of our development and humanitarian work if we don't look at accessibility. And there's also an urgency around it. With 10 years left to meet the SDGs principle of leave no one behind, we really feel that it's timely that as more and more mainstream agencies realize that people with disabilities, women and men, Indigenous people with disabilities, people of all types of disabilities across the world are being left out of development. And that's really come to light in the last year. COVID-19 has really shone a light on the deep inequalities that exist. And the fact that we've got an even greater recognition and urgency that we need accessibility as a basic prerequisite for life-saving. It's not a nice to have. It's absolutely critical to ensure access to information and essential services. And it's now the time and the urgency to act to remove all barriers. And for CBM Global, we're delighted that this privilege of us working with DPOs is actually, for us, we're recognizing that it's persons with disabilities and their representative organizations, WBU, IDA, the European Disability Forum, ONSE, all of the disability movement that needs to be in the front, leading the change on accessibility. That's critical for the change that we expect to see. And it can't, that's for CBM Global, it's about us having an authentic partnership with the disability movement to really make sure that it's people with disability in lead. Can you move to the next slide? Thanks, Ben. So I just want to tell a little bit of the story of our journey of how this guide came about. And it came about because initially we got a lot of feedback from our own staff and from organizations of persons with disabilities on the fact that we didn't have anything that looked holistically at accessibility. Everything was piecemeal around accessibility. Sometimes accessibility around education a little bit or around health services, but actually we needed a holistic guide, and it was really missing in terms of supporting as a prerequisite for it was stifling so many of our programs in really succeeding and really ensuring full and effective participation of people with disabilities across the board. So it was, for us, we started the process with the Nepalese, we had the cross-disability movement. The Nepal Federation of Disabled Persons were our first partner. Their membership across all impairment groups and constituency groups helped us with refining the first initial draft. And we've been doing a lot of learning with the disability movement in Nepal around building national standards and influencing change. And then from that, we had an initial outline, and we then worked very closely with the World Blind Union, with CBM Global colleagues, but also we had the Bridge alumni, and it was the Bridge CRPD SDGs initiative is a great capacity building initiative that the international disability movement really leads with all its members. And we kept seeing again that accessibility was a critical component to really influence change with governments around implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. So we also had other critical agencies that were partners with us on the New Urban Agenda, the IAPA, the G3C ICT, the UCLG. I think you had discussions with them yesterday on their New Urban Agenda. We realized there were a lot of other partners that we had that were also keen to make sure that we had a way of shifting attitudes and barriers and policy and institutional barriers towards inclusion of persons with disabilities. And the final field testing we had of the guide was actually with the Vivid Consortia. This is a consortia that is a mix of European agencies, a lot from Ireland, as well as the European Disability Forum and Abilis, of agencies committed to inclusive humanitarian action. And that allowed us to use the self-assessments, and you'll be hearing from the European Disability Forum. I'm going to share a little bit of their learning on using that later in the session. But it was a really critical point for us to then recognize this guide could work across all kinds of different agencies and could be supportive of humanitarian as well as development actors. But in fact, it can be just as easily used by business sector, by NGOs, by any agency that is working, providing services, and has a commitment to inclusion. So can you move to the next slide? Thank you, Ben. So basically the core principles behind this guide is that we take forward, what does the CRPD, what does the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, what does it mean actually in practical terms? And so the guide aligns completely with Article 3 of the Convention on the General Principles to ensure autonomy, choice, equality between men and women, full accessibility. So it takes a whole view of the CRPD, and we use the Article 3 to make sure all of the processes on accessibility are inclusive, providing choice, autonomy, dignity, and respect for the inherent diversity that we have as part of our humanity. And the critical principles that this work on accessibility cannot be done without partnership with persons with disabilities and their representative organizations. They are the experts in their lived experience in their own right, and it's critical to have DPOs partnering on accessibility, and it's no longer acceptable to have agencies speaking on behalf of people with disability on the subject of accessibility. It was also that we had the commitment, as our strapline on the guide says, to leave no one behind. And we were particularly interested to make sure the specific measures to ensure the equal participation of all. So this guide talks across all constituency groups, as much for people with psychosocial disability, for blind people, people with low vision, deaf, hard of hearing, deaf, blind, people with learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities. It's a guide that looks at the rights of all persons with disabilities to be fully included in all aspects of life. And finally, the guide is not prescriptive. It gives guidance, and it allows you to take a set of questions that then you can contextualize for your situation. So we weren't going to try and say there is a one size fits all, and we weren't going to try and say that it's one type of approach to accessibility. It's looking at supporting local people, to look at local resources, local solutions, to ensure that the spirit of accessibility, the principle of accessibility in the CRPD is realized. So I'm going to pass back over to you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Kathy, for taking us through that whole rationale and being so clear about how the guide was developed and what is intending to achieve, and also what are the principles that are kind of like underpinning the work around accessibility. So now, if you look at what's the structure of the guide itself? What does it contain in the end as a document? So I would say, and just building on what you were just saying, Kathy, I think, yeah, it's true that the guide is actually looking at an holistic approach, and it's basically how to progressively realize accessibility in various contexts, as you clearly described. It necessarily require an adaptation of the guidance to a local context, to a particular organization, but it was designed to be used by all organizations in any type of context. And for that, I think what's interesting to see in the guide is that there is a component around how do you implement progressively, and it's really looking at what process we should be following. And for that, there is a 3-step process that I will explain a little bit later on, but that's actually that process, engaging step by step into realization of accessibility, that allows organizations to actually improve towards what, and what should be I would say the journey should have a destination. What's our destination? And we know that very often the destination has been sometimes, exclusively around the built environment, like modifying some of the door, building ramps, etc. But we know by experience that accessibility is much more than that. So we developed 7 commitments with self-assessment template and useful resource that look at very diverse aspects of accessibility to an organization to really tackle accessibility from a comprehensive and holistic lens. With that, we included 6 advocacy briefs. So those accessibility briefs, basically, very interesting because they kind of build the business case for accessibility. So they help organizations to actually get evidence and information to support creating buying inside the organization, and also to explain how those accessibility relate to overdevelopment issues. And Hannes, my colleague, will be speaking around that. And you can find those advocacy briefs. There are dividers between the different commitments, and you can find them in the guide. And finally, we had, and that's so important that we included a glossary of key terms of definition, because we realized that There are so many definitions of accessibility according to who is using that term that we thought was very interesting and important to actually make sure that we had a comprehensive list of at least key terms and what do they mean and what do they mean in relation to the guide that we try to develop. So when we look at the 7 commitments, and just to go, I'm not going to go in detail, we'll share the link with the guide to the guide later on, but just so you have like an idea of what does it tackle in terms of commitment. The first commitment is around workplaces and premises. So it really looks at accessibility of the built environment, specifications, standards, the process of doing accessibility audit, how do we do that? The second one is really around digital accessibility, looking at information and communication in an organization and how do we make them accessible to persons with disabilities. One critical aspect was to look at procurement. So how to ensure that procurement of goods, services, and facilities actually include accessibility criteria. The fourth one is around capacity development, knowledge management, and learning systems. So how do we design those systems internally to ensure that people can equally contribute and benefit, whether it's like in internal community of practice, for instance. The fifth one is around program and services. How do we make sure they are not discriminatory and they are accessible to everyone? The sixth one, very important since COVID-19 particularly, we all work remotely. We conduct lots of meetings online. And of course, we need to look at how to make all meetings and events accessible, since it's just like one of the key for all of us to actually engage in discussion and in decision making. And last but not least, the importance of how do we make our workplaces inclusive. And this really looks at creating an environment to support all staff to thrive, but also what does it mean providing reasonable accommodation for employees with disabilities where needed. So once we have identified those areas, which basically is the destination, it's the kind of like commitment we do, then how do we implement that? And I think that's where the process comes into place. And it's a 3-step process. And, the first step is always getting prepared. And what does it mean? It's basically getting prepared for doing an assessment. So how do we do? Do we do well when we look at those 7 commitments, and what are the gaps, and where do we need to improve? Where we are at in terms of taking the journey towards accessibility? That's what that first phase is about. And the self-assessment tool are about to help organization on how to actually prepare that journey and do that assessment. Once we have prepared and do the assessment, then what kind of like priorities we should agree on, and what should we take forward, and what realistic time frame, what resources, and who is responsible for taking those priorities forward. And the last step is about putting the action plan into action. So once we identify the priorities, the resources, then how do we put that into action in a plan, and then how do you evaluate action? And obviously that's not an end process, because that process will repeat itself as you go through implementation, and then as you reach improvement on accessibility, you will then reassess and then re-agree on priorities, and then update your action plan as you move forward. And obviously, all of this will serve one purpose of the organization being more accessible, but obviously, like, there's a bigger and a broader business case for accessibility, and that's what the guide is also trying to make. And that's what we did with the different advocacy brief inside the guide. And for that, I would just like ask my colleague Hannes Juling-Lagrerius from World Bank Union, who is also the program officer and bilateral associate expert, who has been leading the work of World Bank Union on the global program on inclusive and accessible urban development, to just take us through some of those benefits, like to which extent accessibility can benefit organization. And Hannes, can you hear us? Are you?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, very good. Hi, Hannes.
Perfect.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Benjamin. And I mean, first and foremost, I'd like to stress that our world today, our cities and our communities are constituted by different types of entities and organizational ecosystems. And as you presented just in a few minutes ago, really the directions organizations take on accessibility, whether it's within the disability rights movement or outside, will directly influence how inclusive we are ourselves in our daily practice, and ultimately influence how inclusive our impact is in how we're trying to change the society in a positive way. And I mean, just to reiterate the point that before going over to the business case, is that accessibility, it can never be a tick the box exercise. And as the approach taken in the guide, we are trying to take a holistic approach to accessibility, because accessibility is dynamic as requirements differ both within and between groups. And ultimately, a more accessible society and accessible community benefits everyone, whoever we are, and also throughout the course of our life. So going over a bit to the business case as captured in the accessibility guide, the previously mentioned pitch advocacy briefs or advocacy pitches, as Benjamin mentioned. And the first is first and foremost about meeting legal obligations. Many countries and also provinces and local and regional governments have laws, legislation, standards on accessibility, and which we're all obliged to follow in that jurisdiction. And sometimes also accessibility standards have been adopted as legislation in that specific context. So it's working to integrate accessibility throughout. It's also about how do we live up to the regulations and laws and laws and legislations. But sometimes accessibility standards where we live might not be fit for purpose or not in line with the CRPD. And hence we have to take a broader lens also on how we respond to international accessibility standards. The second text box I'm showing also on the screen, and which you can dwell more into in the guide, is about accessibility can also help us to be more economical. If we integrate accessibility from the start of any project or process, we can avoid later possible corrective and retrofitting measures to remove barriers in accessibility. And doing so, we have to also aim for a universal design result, which in the end will be more cost effective and also foster social and economic benefits for the organization and for community. And for some organizations, it will also help you to increase the customer base and also how you work on innovation. Thirdly, it will support you to become more environmentally friendly. By making accessibility consideration in your organization, in any organization, can help make our operations more sustainable and environmentally friendly, as retrofitting or the previously mentioned corrective measures later on will also take much different resources will also consume a lot of resources. And whether it's about making an area, service, or space accessible, it must be well planned. And then we can also lessen our ecological footprint and ultimately combat the climate change crisis. Accessibility can also help us, by promoting accessibility, we can also improve how we work on increasing resilience. And removing accessibility barriers in the organization, by doing so, we can be more resilient, we can create better, safe environment for all employees and their communities. And accessibility can really help us prepare for crisis and reduce the negative impacts of disasters. And COVID-19 pandemic, as previously mentioned, can also exemplify an occurrence of where accessibility were not sufficiently integrated in everyday practice from the start, leaving people at risk, excluding people, and exacerbating inequalities. Fifth, it's about promoting integrating accessibility can also help us promote well-being and that we do no harm. It can help us to enhance everyone's well-being all around, because environments that are healthy for all, it improves our quality of life throughout increased social inclusion, and more active living, safety, and access to nature. Because a siloed approach to accessibility, for instance, when it comes to the planning, for example, of a residential area, if you just make that specific area in a city accessible, then that can further foster segregation, not inclusion. And lastly, by promoting accessibility, we can create more inclusive communities and cities. Because in a few decades, over 2 billion persons with disabilities and older persons will reside in cities. And this is putting an immense pressure on cities and local governments to adapt their structures and strategies and spaces so we all have a good quality of life where we reside. And by putting accessibility at the heart of our communities and how they are developed will increase our independence as persons with different disabilities, our autonomy, and the possibility, and also that we can actually enjoy the right of equal access to public spaces and services, and that we can be also participating in our communities and have a voice in how they are developed. In the program I'm leading at the World Blind Union, the Global Program for Inclusive and Accessible Urban Development, we have made great use of this guide throughout. It has helped us to really underpin advocacy, support World Blind Union and our partners to better understand what accessibility is, what it can be in different contexts, and how it can really be situated in a context like urban planning and design. It has served us very well as a strong go-to reference and resource. And it has, by saying that, just to exemplify, is that we have been able to use the Accessibility Go Guide to Action to support us in our multi-stakeholder partnerships, in our technical support to our partners in reviewing of their policies, normative work, projects and work plan. And ultimately, it has helped us to support and guide our partners on how to assess how well they're actually doing in terms of accessibility. And you can read so much more about this on the different pitch cards or advocacy briefs in Accessibility Go, a guide to action. So I hand it back over to you, Benjamin. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Hannes. Yeah, I mean, it's brilliant also to see, the way it has been, taken through the discussion on urban development, especially, the webinar we had yesterday was really demonstrating that. And I think one of the main learning we had when we're working on that is like, ultimately accessibility starts with every one of us. And I mean, we're all responsible, right? You don't necessarily need to be responsible for accessibility to actually to care about accessibility, because we all work in so many different environments that we all have a role to play in helping improving accessibility practices within our organization. We ultimately, exactly as you said, are the backbone of our communities, right? Whether we work with local association, whether we work in private businesses or within a municipality, we all have a key role to play in ensuring that the environment that we offer to our employees or customers is actually accessible to everyone. So thanks a lot for helping us like bringing that aspect into the broader issues of development and how that accessibility can help organization to contribute to that agenda. Yeah.
Ben, can I just come in for a second? Because we've got a really interesting question that's come in that I think would be great for Hannes and you to answer now. Yeah, it's a great question from Luis Diaz de la Guardia, Bolivar. My apologies for my Spanish, but it's how much of a negative impact can the overdevelopment of accessibility have? So how much of a negative impact can the overdevelopment of accessibility have?
Overdevelopment in terms of?
I'm assuming that, and maybe we could have a follow-up point from Luis, but I'm assuming that that negative impact that he thinks that if we address accessibility too much, that it might be overshadowing other aspects. So I'm just, for me, it's a prerequisite. So I don't see it as a negative. I would say it's actually an utter prerequisite. And in fact, we don't have, I can't think of any examples of overdevelopment, but I thought I'd put that to Hannes now that Hannes is talking to different urban actors, and how do we get that dialogue going between different actors?
Absolutely, yeah. Hannes, do you want to share a bit around that, or?
Yeah, no, I definitely. I think as Kathy elaborated on, and I think it's actually a good question, but I mean. So we always see that it's a prerequisite for inclusion. And I think from my urban development perspective, it's unfortunately not often a strong focus. It's often, at least in the global discussion, mistaken for something else, not really realizing what accessibility is about. And I think accessibility from my perspective is absolutely core for any other working area, may it be climate change, humanitarian action, the disaster risk reduction, etc. and also how our cities are planned and designed. Could be in the area of WASH, etc. Because if it's, I think there it's important to reiterate that we have to see accessibility as something cross-cutting, that we cannot silo accessibility into a tick the box exercise, that it has to be mainstreamed. And if it's sufficiently mainstreamed, then it will not be an overinvestment or overly focused on accessibility. But just quickly as well, I think an over focus on accessibility could be that we are trying to develop very specialized solutions, which might not have been needed if accessibility were fully integrated. So I think sometimes the global discussion on accessibility could be too narrow and too focused, and to look for a very specific solution to a problem which can be solved by more comprehensive action, for example, by local and regional governments.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Alice, for bringing that. And I would add that ultimately, accessibility is a process rather than a goal. So I would say some of the learning that we have is that very often when people focus really on accessibility, they just focus on accessibility, but they don't look at the outcome. Actually, the outcome is participation. It's equal participation. It's inclusion. And that's what accessibility is. It's a precondition. It's a vehicle to ensure people are included and they can enjoy their life and their right in the community. But very often, accessibility is seen more as compliance with standards. And of course, then if you take that only that lens, standards are very important, but the end goal is participation. And then if you take really a narrow lens on accessibility, I think that's where it can become dangerous. That's all. For example, it can lead certain decisions in cities where you would create specific area of the city that are accessible, but that are not necessarily inclusive in the community, right? So I think that whole aspect around accessibility, I think it's just about understanding accessibility as a collective good, as something that is mandatory, as something that you can't reach sustainable development without accessibility. So I think that's not really an option. And in the way you deliver that, you need to be comprehensive and inclusive of all. And I think that's where our discussion is with the accessibility goal. It's to have organization of persons with disabilities and persons with disabilities themselves guiding and deciding for them what accessibility is and what is better for them in the end. So without further ado, I think that's a nice transition to the next topic, which really look at the guide and the way it was developed. And in that development, there was one question that was actually raised around, how do we, when we develop guidance, especially document, how do we ensure that we make them accessible? And for that, I would like to ask my colleague, Enoch Bani Dubé, who is working with the World Bank Union as a NORAD fellow and has been supporting World Bank Union's work in so many different areas and different programs, including supporting Hannes and I with the work on inclusive cities, but also supporting the development of the accessibility goal. And Enoch Bani, are you here? Can you hear us?
Yes, thank you very much, Benjamin. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes, very well. Yeah, the connection is perfect. So so great to have you with us. And you know that I had a couple of questions I wanted to ask you when it comes to PDF accessibility.
Okay.
And one being, and if I may start by one, because I think that's a common, maybe a common question that I had actually, and it was around yes. Why is actually PDF generally less preferred by people who use screen reader, for instance, over format, like for example Word document or etc. Can you tell us a little bit more around that?
Okay, thank you for that interesting question, Benjamin. One of the most most common misconception around issues on accessibility of PDFs is that people using screen reading softwares are not able to usually manipulate the content usually in the PDFs. So by nature, a PDF file is meant to preserve a certain format that would have been chosen by the designer, and so some of those preserved designs are the ones that have turned persons with that most users of screen reading softwares against the PDFs. While the PDF file or format is one of the most accessible formats, especially if we're ranking them after HTML. So why people prefer Microsoft Word is because broadly it's because
I think we lost connection with Enoch Bani. Enoch Bani, can you hear us? I hope you'll be able to reconnect.
If to access information is having a text or whatever information being presented as readable text, so which largely Microsoft Word documents will provide. But however, that is just the entry point. If we then go deeper to look at the specific aspects, such as how the information is organized, the information is structured, be it in those particular documents, then that's where the challenge comes now. Yeah. To say designers of most documents, they usually overlook those accessibility features, and then that end is the one that really turns people against, particularly the PDF, because people cannot manipulate the content that is within the PDF format. So that's the major challenge that is there. Otherwise, in terms of accessibility, the PDF format has more and better features that help not only the user, but also the designers and those that are producing the information to say.
Thank you a lot.
Yes.
We lost you for.
Yes, I can hear you, Ben.
We lost you a bit for a second, but I think we capture most of your point, and I think you mentioned.
Oh, okay.
You mentioned that ultimately accessing the content is not that the format itself is not accessible, but like any documents, if they're not made accessible, then people will struggle to access the content and navigate through such a document. And you mentioned actually an interesting point that very often we face in accessibility also in the built environment, which ultimately, people who are responsible for building those type of format, whether they are like designer or it will be an architect in the case of a building, in the case of a PDF or a website, that would be designer, people who are actually IT specialists working in those areas. Actually, they need to know the requirement. They need to know, the web guidelines and the different criteria you need to follow in order to make those actually digital environment and content and document accessible. So, I heard and we discussed about that actually you've been part. When we're working on the guide, we've been part of developing also a checklist, and I know that you've been working with designers. So the designer who actually developed the guide actually worked with you as well to develop that checklist. Can you tell us just a few words around that checklist, and can we find it also online on the World Blind Union websites?
Oh yes, thank you very much once again, Ben. The checklist is a product of the process that we're working on with the designers and an accessibility expert to ground our journey in a tangible document that we can follow and hold ourselves accountable.
Sorry, if you can hear me, I think the connection is not good.
That standards which we must follow as signing our after working with you in the process.
Yeah, we are sorry about that. Like, we have experienced some technical issues, but let me just summarize quickly is that what Anogbani was actually explaining is actually that he's been supporting the designers while they were developing the guide to actually look at how do we improve PDF accessibility. And you will find the result of that work is on the World and Union website, and we'll share the link at the end. But basically, as you download the guide, you will be also able to download the checklist that you can use. You can use to work with your designers. You can use to help other organization or even your organization, people working in communication and web design or content development, to actually use that checklist to help actually get some guidance on ensuring PDF accessibility. We thought that would be useful, and we wanted to share that with you as well, because we thought that from our process, that was one of the main learning, that we need to really work, even like we work with the document, we need to work with designers on how do we push back, we go beyond the standards and we ensure that we walk the talk on universal design. Thanks a lot, Enogbani, and I'm sorry for the connection, but it was great at least for hearing from you and have the chance to discuss that important topic that we know it's a critical aspect of access to information. Now I would like to move to a second round of panelists, and Cathy, if you would like to introduce Rosario and Alradi.
Yes, I'd be delighted to, Ben. So delighted to introduce two of our bridge, basically gurus. These are some of the people that have really been leading bridge across the Latin America and Middle East regions. Rosario Galares is the Intersectionalities Officer at the International Disability Alliance Capacity Building Unit, and Alradi Abdallah is the Training of Trainers TOT Officer. Both have got great regional and national experience. They both also worked a part of regional and the World Blind Union networks in their regions as well. So we just wanted to share with you some of the complexities. So Rosario, I don't know if you could put your camera on and just sound check your mic. And Alradi, make sure I've got both of you with us.
Could you hear me, Cathy?
Yes, fantastic. Now I can hear you and see you. Wonderful. And Alradi, I'd love to invite you to also put your camera on, if you don't mind, and your mic. Make sure that we've got.
Hello, Kat and everyone.
Great. Thanks, Alradi. So we can't see you, Alradi. I think you need to flip your camera. But we can see you perfectly, Rosario. So, so my first question really, and maybe perhaps Rosario, I'll go to you first, but it's the same question for you as well, Alradi, where you sort your camera, is what gets lost in translation and what are the main challenges you have? So perhaps listening to Rosario first on the challenges that have been in the Spanish and in the Latin America region.
Okay, Cathy, especially in this kind of documents that are related to accessibility, to persons with disabilities, you need to have in order to translate that, you need to have a background, at least within the CRPD, for instance, because most of the language needs to be CRPD compliant. And sometimes, for instance, I have the problems in many documents, not in this, but in many documents when I have to translate reasonable accommodation into Spanish, and sometimes the translation is not accurate. That's why, I mean, because they haven't reviewed maybe the CRPD language, that's why, I mean, they don't have an accurate translation of some terms, some definitions of the CRPD. And also when you say on equal basis with others, sometimes this definition is not being accurate when you translate into Spanish. It's not because of the person doesn't have the maybe the knowledge of translating. It's because maybe this person is not properly close to documents about disability, about civility, or about intersectionality. And also sometimes intersectionality is also a very difficult term to translate sometimes into Spanish. When you say also cross disability, it's very difficult because there's not like a one word to say cross disability in Spanish. That's why sometimes you have to use more than one word to do that. And also I think the other challenge is that you don't need to be very literal with the translation, because sometimes you need to understand more the context of the region. If you understand the concept, maybe you can change the one word, maybe instead of one word, you can put 2 or 3 words, but it's better because if you do that, you can maybe, you can achieve the good understanding of the person, especially Spanish speaking people. I remember in this guide, for instance, the word partially sighted, I mean, it's not properly translated into Spanish, I mean, because it says visión parcial, and the common term in Spanish is baja visión. That's why this is something that we need to check in this guide, for instance. It's something that I review. But this is these are some of the main challenges, especially in translation. You need to be CRPD compliant. You need to be familiar with all that terminology surrounding disability, surrounding diversity. And if you are not familiar with that, maybe is probably that you can make some mistakes.
Great, thank you, Rosario. And now the same question to you, Alradi, and don't worry, I think you can put your camera off, Alradi. It just seems that the camera is facing the opposite direction to you. But not to worry, because as long as we can hear you and we know that you're calling in from Kenya. So Alradi, can you tell us, some of the challenges, particularly in the Arabic region, on what gets lost in translation when we translate from English to Arabic?
Hello, everyone. The issue is translation of such document. It have a lot of concept. That concept actually has been developed in English language. And when you would like to translate that to other language, you translate the concept, you don't translate the language. So you need to convey every message that in that language, because you need to put it in another language with the same meaning, with the same idea about that such concept. So that's mean you need some time to develop even a new language in that language. For example, to translate accessibility to Arabic or intersectionality to Arabic, you need to work on that language to create some terminology that really tell us about what accessibility means. And another challenge that, and as Rosario mentioned, that you need to have a good language on another hand, and you need to understand the CRPD concept and human rights-based approach to disability in order to put the right word and to put the right meaning in another language. Other challenge that we face, we need, in some language, some word is being used differently from region to another. For example, in Arabic, some word is used differently in Sudan, comparing with Egypt, comparing with Gulf country, comparing with Morocco and Tunisian language. So you need to use words that is really reflecting the differences between the use of language among the populations that use Arabic language. And last challenge that we face, we need to translate the word and the concept to the Arabic, but on the same time, we need to translate it in easy to understand language. as we are discussing about accessibility, we need to use accessible information. I mean, accessible language for all persons with disabilities, language that could be understandable by all persons with disabilities across the region. And in this case, we have what we call classic Arabic, which is quite difficult for most like underrepresented group of persons with disabilities, and so we needed to go a little that classic Arabic in order to use a quite simple language that really can be convey the message about the guidance and convey the translation in a way that could be understood by all.
Thanks, Al-Radi. And that leads nicely onto my last question to you both. If you could just briefly tell us a little bit about the challenge of trying to get the right balance between making sure that the guide is rights-based and it's speaking to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but that it's still user-friendly, that it's accessible in everyday language, that anyone can pick up the guide, whether it's a shopkeeper running a service, or someone on a transport union, that anyone could pick up the guide and use it. So Rosario and Radi, would you like to speak to that? Just briefly. Rosario, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure.
Go already. I think you are going to start. So.
Okay, sure. Yeah, this is really a big challenge, but we work on that by having the translation being peer reviewed by different people who have both background on language and on the human rights-based approach to disabilities. And in the Arab region, we had a meeting together between British CRPD SDG alumni from different countries. We have alumni from Jordan, another one from Lebanon, and two from Sudan, and another one from Tunisia, just to discuss across the language that used by Arab region in the Arab region, and to have different perspective from different people who speak Arabic, and on the same time they have the background. So, and here, I mean, they are all British alumni, so they went through this training and they know a lot about how the CRPD language can be used in different contexts. By that, we are still discussing and we solve some terminology that could be reflective for the CRPD perspective on accessibilities and such related concept, and language that could be easy to use everywhere and by everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Radi. And I know that you had a really interesting discussion around having different age groups, older people in the group and younger people, to get different generational aspects. And you had different women and men, and you had different impairment groups that use language differently, communicate differently. So we're really looking forward to the Arabic version, and really thankful to the team that are doing that. So Rosario, just to pass to you quickly on how you see getting that balance right between rights-based and making sure it's still accessible and user-friendly for people.
Okay, Kathy, taking into account what I already mentioned about, I think for me, it is necessary that maybe if you're going to see the guide for first time, maybe you need to have like a very knowledge, like a small knowledge, little knowledge about terminology of CRPD, or maybe human rights-based approach. And then you are going to understand the guide, and also you can also try to disseminate with all your group or your organization, and trying to make some small training. And also for me, what I really noticed in this Accessibility Go guide is like this, when you read this guide, you are going to have like a broad sense of how accessibility means. Because sometimes when you belong to a disability constituency, you only think that accessibility is like, for instance, if you are a person who are blind, you only see accessibility like access to information. If you are a person who physical disability, you only think that accessibility means elevators or ramps or these kind of things. But if you have you take a look to this guide, you're going to have like a broad sense about accessibility. You're going to notice also how to make events accessible, and also how to use easy to read versions, because sometimes most of us don't think about what important is to use easy to read, not only for people with learning disabilities, but also for persons who are indigenous, and because maybe persons whose primary language is not English or is not Spanish, and this kind of thing. And sometimes to have this in plain language or easy to read language, definitely it will be make possible to all people to understand more about accessibility issues.
Thank you, Rosario.
Other organizations.
Thank you, Rosario. And we had a question coming in if it's in French. And yes, the guide's been translated into French, and we've got a group also working on making sure that we've not lost anything in translation into the French version. And as Rosario said, we've also got a team WBU is leading, working with other disability groups, members of the International Disability Alliance and regional members, to develop an easy read. And just to say that there's also a glossary, as Ben mentioned, in the guide, and that's to try and make sure that people don't get stuck. It's hyperlinked, and it's, if you come to a term that you don't know, you can hyperlink, and you've got very nice straightforward explanations of key terms, so that there's no barriers to understanding the guide as you go, we hope. So Ben, can I pass back to you?
Yes, of course, and thanks a lot, because who could tell that we learn so much just from translation, translating guidance. And I mean, these are just powerful learning that we really take with us and that we carry with us as we move forward, because it's such a rich experience to ensure that no one is left behind from that process. And Rosario was explaining that as part of the learning that we all had. And I mean, it's really interesting to be part of that journey. And when I speak about journey towards accessibility, I'm taking the opportunity to introduce our next speaker, Marion Steff, who has been working as International Cooperation Manager for the European Disability Forum. We are so delighted to have EDF with us today, and I'm saying journey at the beginning of my sentence when I introduced you, because the first time we started to talk around that, you told me, accessibility is a journey, and we've been into that journey for quite some time now, and we have gathered so much learning around that, and it's such a pleasure to have you here, because some of the learning you would like to share with us is actually based on the based on the Accessibility Go, but more specifically on the self-assessment tool, which are basically a way to mark and guide, basically survey the organization and benchmark where we are at in terms of accessibility. So, Marion, how are you? And glad to have you with us. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, thank you, Benjamin. It's really a pleasure to be here to represent EDF. So thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Kathy. And also I'm delighted to be among other speakers. I'm also learning a lot, the business case and the translation, the PDF, etc. It's very interesting. So just a brief word on EDF. EDF is an organization of persons with disabilities. We are based in Belgium, in Brussels, and we have about 100 members across Europe. We have been using the guide and the self-assessment tools. And if that's okay, I'm going to give a bit of a background around that. EDF is part of a project called VVT. And it is in that framework that we've been using the guide and the self-assessment tools. So the project is made of 7 consortium members, and CBM Global, along CBM Ireland, is the lead organization. And then that project is funded by the EU, and we're focusing on humanitarian action, on volunteering and disability. So in a nutshell, the VVT project's main aim is to create a global community of practice working towards disability inclusion in humanitarian action and in volunteering. So what we've done, we had to, within that project, to assess ourselves, when it comes to humanitarian action, when it comes to volunteering, and when it comes to disability inclusion. And then it was decided internally that actually why reinventing the wheel when actually this wonderful resource was there and available to be tested. What we had to do is, well, first we read intensively, you know, the guide and the self-assessment tools, and then to see if this was in link with the work we are doing. And I'm sorry, I think England has just scored because I'm here like scream of joys for the Euro. So I'm sorry if you hear a background noise. Maybe they didn't score, it was almost a goal, I don't know. Sorry about that. So I was saying that we also, so we studied the guide and saw that it was actually appropriate for us to use. And we had to gather a little team within our organization to see who was going to actually use the guides and the self-assessment tools. So we were encouraged to use senior management and key decision maker from our organization. That, you know, EDF is really small. We have about 15 staff. So we really, with just the three of us that were involved, my director, Catherine Norton, my colleague working on finance and human resources, and myself. So, well, we actually worked together and sit down and completed the tools, and then it was actually really easy going. And then at the end, when we used it, when we finished, we were reported with a report with the result, and the report was confidential. Because, as I say, we were part of a consortium, and the idea wasn't really to compare each other on accessibility to prove we're doing better than others. That wasn't the case. It's just to really improve our own practice. Does it make sense, Benjamin?
Oh, no, absolutely, and I mean, it's quite interesting also from your experience, because you were saying that, you know, ultimately the guide is not like made specifically for humanitarian action, you know, but what was interesting in the process is also how do you use the, you know, as part of that consortium, how do you use the guide to actually work with the different partner, and exactly as I say, not to compete, but actually to learn and exchange. And then, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think one of the results when you say was the report, then one of the results of that report was also to identify some key actions so that then you could start engaging more in depth into certain areas, for example, digital accessibility, and starting to do training. And then instead of doing just one training for one person, or that training becomes part of the journey of the organization, it becomes part of the journey of advancing towards improving accessibility based on the assessment that was done. And then since the assessment was done in collaboration, it makes it easier to actually invite other people to attend that training. So it's a very complementary effort, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And as for us, you know, we had different learnings, if you want, that I could share, is that, you know, no organization is perfect in terms of accessibility. I wish we could say we're perfect and we know it all, but it's not the case. You know, there's always room for improvement. There's always more that we have to learn, because accessibility is not static. It always evolves with time. It evolves with technology. It also evolves with experience. You know, we continue to learn, and then using the self-assessment tools have been very important for us. So what we were encouraged to do within the consortium is also to, well, first to have, or to brief colleagues of the result and to share the result and brainstorm together on what we could do, but also to support other colleagues from the consortium or the organization in case they needed a bit of guidance, of a bit more understanding about what is accessibility, because some of those organizations, they expert on volunteering, but not necessarily on, you know, on disability inclusion, for instance. You know, we came up, for instance, at EDF with an action plan on what we could do. And then we also provided a workshop for the members of the consortium And then an important point is to realize that, I mean, you know, accessibility seems to be straightforward, but it is not, like, you know, we realized that our colleagues in the different organization needed more guidance on what is exactly accessibility. So going back to the basic, like an accessible Word document, accessible PowerPoint, accessible meetings online, you know. And then so we have now someone working on accessibility that is there to provide guidance. So she doesn't do the job for others, but she provides the tips for others to learn. And I think it's important to you know, to provide those tools. And then we also now share more of that with our own members. So most of our members are actually DPOs, and they're quite happy to receive all these toolkits that now we are creating. And that's helped us to improve the community of practice in general within that project, because that's one of the goals.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It's truly inspiring and very nice to see how the guide is not an end in itself. It's just, you know, exactly as you say, it's just supporting processes, and just people can use it in different ways. And I think your journey, or what you were explaining from that journey, those learnings are quite unique, because they are your learning from your organization, but I'm sure people who have been working on accessibility will also share some of those learning as well, because ultimately, you know, it carries out some of the same, more or less same experiences. And we always have to go back to accessibility of PowerPoint. What does it mean to have a Word document accessible, and so on? And this is what somehow is exciting as well, because once it's part of a plan, it becomes part of the DNA of the organization, which ultimately, you know, is the key to actually answer that. And, you know, I'm not going to leave you on this, because I also want to take that opportunity to ask you if maybe you would like to share one or two tips or recommendation for other organizations who are listening right now and would like to start engaging, if you don't mind, Marion.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, the tip is really don't hesitate. Just go get the tool. You know, the is online, is there. It's been translated in different languages. I think it's just use it. You can use some part of it or the whole tool. You know, you can focus on one section or the other. And then I think it's quite good for an organization to see where they can improve themselves. And then there's a lot of resources that you can find online, but I also know that, for instance, we receive some guidance from CBM Global, and from, you know, I know WBU and CBM Global are there also to provide guidance. And then it's been mentioned before, but it's important to contact organizations of persons with disabilities, because they can also help and provide some guidance on how making sure that your own organization, you know, is inclusive in like the different areas of an organization. So yeah,
absolutely. And I think that's the entire philosophy of the guide, is ultimately to create a dialogue between, you know, organization of persons with disabilities and those who are responsible for designing, managing environment in which we live, basically, you know, whether they're physical or digital. There are designers behind this, you know, so we need to collaborate to start, you know, improving that, because ultimately,
and then you know, you keep, and then people start to get more aware about the CRPD and, you know, all those human rights terms, and that is important to include in the strategic thinking of an organization, for instance. So
excellent. It was a pleasure, Marion, to hear from you and for sharing this. And we're happy also to continue and to hear more about your journey as well. I'm sure there will be other opportunities to share around that aspect as well. And now I would like to move to our next speaker, Lourdes González Perea. It's a great pleasure to have you from ONCE Foundation. We are really happy to hear from you, to hear from your work, because we know you are expert in technology and accessibility as part of the Directorate for Universal Accessibility, and Innovation, as part of the ONCE Foundation. And we were quite interesting, you know, to learn more about your current work, and also to learn more about, like, how does that guide and everything you heard today could actually ultimately help supporting the work you do. Lourdes, can you hear us? and buenas tardes, I guess, in Spain.
Hola, muy buenas tardes. En primer lugar, muchísimas gracias por invitarme a participar. Es un placer para mí contaros pues, mi experiencia tanto en la organización en la que trabajo como utilizando la guía. Bueno, la ONCE la conocéis, sabéis que es la Organización Nacional de Personas Ciegas en España, pero la ONCE tiene una herramienta de solidaridad con el resto de las discapacidades que es la Fundación ONCE, una organización que pertenece a la ONCE y que la ONCE tiene una trayectoria de más de 80 años, la Fundación ONCE no tanto, pero aún así tenemos a nuestras espaldas más de 30 años de experiencia. ¿Qué hacemos en la Fundación ONCE? Pues por un lado promovemos la formación y la empleabilidad de las personas con discapacidad y por otro lado ayudamos a las organizaciones a que incorporen la accesibilidad, que es justo el área en la que me ubico yo, accesibilidad universal e innovación. ¿Cómo lo hacemos? Pues de diferentes modos. Por un lado, sensibilizamos en esta materia, damos formación, desarrollamos proyectos de I+D+I, firmamos convenios de colaboración, pues por ejemplo para llevar a la construcción, al diseño de nuevos productos y servicios que de alguna manera se basen en la accesibilidad y en definitiva desarrollamos un montón de acciones adaptadas a las diferentes organizaciones para tratar de que incorporen la accesibilidad. En estos temas, vamos, en el grupo social 11 llevo trabajando en torno a 18 años y en lo que es la Fundación 11 específicamente más de 2 años, en los que en total he tenido oportunidad de trabajar con organizaciones de todos los ámbitos. Trabajamos con administraciones públicas, centros educativos, grandes empresas, pequeñas empresas. Y bueno, realmente la guía pues, nos resulta un trabajo pues, de utilidad, un documento de utilidad porque al final es un documento en el que han participado expertos de diferentes materias, un documento en el que se aborda la accesibilidad de forma transversal, que eso es muy importante. Nosotros, por ejemplo, en Fundación 11 siempre decimos que la accesibilidad tiene que contemplar una triple perspectiva. Por un lado, contemplar la diversidad humana, no solo centrado en discapacidad, sino también en personas que no hablan nuestra misma lengua, personas mayores, la diversidad de medios de los que disponen las personas. Si hablamos de tecnología, pues lógicamente diversidad de navegadores, de dispositivos y la diversidad de contextos, porque como bien sabéis, una condición de alta luminosidad, de mucho ruido y demás, puede provocar necesidades de servicios de accesibilidad. Por tanto, creemos que la guía como tal está totalmente alineada con cómo la Fundación 11 aborda la accesibilidad y cómo la Fundación 11 transmite con los diferentes proyectos esta idea a todas las organizaciones, por lo que se convierte para nosotros en un documento de referencia, que además el hecho de que esté traducido a varios idiomas también facilita el trabajo con organizaciones internacionales.
Thank you. Muchas gracias, Lourdes. And I really like what you said about diversity and celebrating diversity of like human diversity, diversity of environments, and diversity of context. Really at the heart of the work on accessibility, and it's also something that has been really part of the guide as well. So moving forward, I wanted to ask you, and I'm sure we have lots of people on the meeting right now and participants who have been working on accessibility, who may know already accessibility or who would like to engage more on accessibility. I was quite interested to know more from you. What are your key learnings from the experience as experts in technology and accessibility? What has been maybe one or two key learning and advice for people who would like to engage in that work?
Bueno, pues realmente hemos aprendido mucho. Lo primero que hemos aprendido es que la accesibilidad no es solo para las personas con discapacidad, sino, como he comentado, es un concepto mucho más amplio. Y luego también hemos aprendido un tema muy importante y es la accesibilidad cognitiva, ¿no? Que partimos desde el propio concepto de accesibilidad, que no todo el mundo lo entiende de la misma manera, pero que también hay la necesidad de que los entornos, las tecnologías sean comprendidas por todo el mundo. Por eso, para mí, el aprendizaje que más me llevo y el que siempre me gusta transmitir es el no solo pensar en dificultades que pueden ser más evidentes, como es la falta de visión, la falta de audición, sino pensar mucho en la falta de comprensión, ¿no? La falta de comprensión de un entorno, de una tecnología, de intentar que los entornos sean amigables, que nos entendamos con ellos, ¿no? Entonces, para mí quizás ese es el principal aprendizaje.
This is such an important point, and something that our previous colleague have been mentioning as well. And you raise one of the issue as well that we're dealing right now when it comes to accessibility standards, where standards have been mainly designed at the beginning for like a very narrow focus on accessibility, mainly physical accessibility, and the need that you're actually highlighting to ensure that we embrace and we celebrate diversity as part of universal accessibility and inclusive design is absolutely critical. And I just might end that a quick dialogue and interview asking you maybe what's your plan in terms of like working with the ONCE Foundation and as an expert on technology and accessibility. How do you see using the guide moving forward as part of your work?
No, desde luego es una guía que creo que se puede recomendar a cualquier organización. Desde luego que voy a seguir recomendándola y utilizándola por varios motivos. Primero, por esos 7 principios, ¿no?, en los que se basa, que aborda la accesibilidad de forma tan transversal como decía. Me parece también muy importante la parte de los indicadores y de la autoevaluación. Las organizaciones no quieren que las juzgue, pero sí quieren saber cómo están y cómo mejorar, ¿no? Por eso esa importancia de saber de qué punto parto y cómo puedo crecer como organización en temas de accesibilidad. Y luego ya por último, como os comentaba, muy importante también la internacionalización del propio documento que va a permitir el uso por organizaciones de diferentes países que hablan diferentes idiomas.
Muchas gracias, Lourdes, for sharing with us your experience, and totally agree with you that this guy is just like to kickstart the work for organization, and any organization can actually use it. There is no really boundaries around the use of this guide. I just would like to highlight as well that, of course, the guide will make it available in as many languages as possible, but always with actually ensuring that the translation is actually accurate. And we got really great explanation from Rosario and Al-Radi as to what it entails, translating such a document and what is the process. And we always try to make sure we follow the human rights-based approach when we develop document and do the translation. And would like to thank you again, Lourdes, and obviously we're going to stay in touch because we want to hear more about your work, especially on technology, because we think that's really something that will carry a lot in terms of ensuring that we have environments that are accessible, and we know how technology is important in terms of innovation for organization, and we hope we can continue the dialogue beyond just today. So it was a great pleasure to have you, and now I'm going to pass it on to Cathy for maybe the way forward and what's ahead of us.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And it is an exciting journey that we're on. And thank you for so many of you that have been asking in the chat box about translations and availability and for the recordings. And just say we're very glad that ONCE are helping to make sure that all the recordings will be available if you're having to dart between sessions. And we've just put in the chat box the link to Accessibility Go that you can download and use it straight away. And at the end, we'll be coming to how we can support further if organizations are interested. But I just want to pass now back again to Rosario and to Al-Radi to share with us some of the plans. Al-Radi, can I ask you first, as the training officer with the International Disability Alliance, working across all regions, can you tell us a little bit about what the plan you have for using Accessibility Go? Alradi, we still got you with us?
Hello again.
Great, we can see you now, Alradi. Perfect. That's good. You can put your camera on. It's facing the right way. We're delighted to see you if you put your camera on.
Hello, everyone. Yes. Usually, when we done with bridge training, we will have alumni. So we will have a trajectory to more build the capacity of those alumni according to their profile and their interest. Indeed, part of those alumni will be interested in going further to develop their capacity in regard to accessibility. And now we have this tools, which is great guidance to help the further development of those alumni. So this will be one of the tools to use to use in the TOT process to equip bridge alumni to equip them with some knowledge in accessibility. And the good things now we have this practical tool. It's not only about theory. Yeah, they have already read about the general comment from the CRBD committee, general comment number 2 on accessibility. They have already been trained about the essential and of having accessibility. Now this is a new steps that they learn how to do the disability check, how to do the disability audit. With this tool, they can be having more practical knowledge on how to do the accessibility itself. And that indeed will be a great opportunity for them to further develop their capacity and to practice that knowledge on the ground and to share it with the other DBOs, as the DBOs always should be considered as a key organization to feedback on accessibility, as they have the lived experience with disabilities, and they can tell us what worked with them or not. And now they can tell us what worked with them or not through their lived experience and through the knowledge that they can get.
Thank you, Aradi. I think we just lost your voice there at the very end, but it's exciting, Aradi, to hear how you're going to be using the guide to build disability leadership at all levels, using the guide to really influence change and across everything from inclusive employment rights to buildings to digital accessibility. It's really exciting. Thank you, Aradi. And can I just ask Rosario, as the intersectionality officer of the International Disability Alliance, how are you going to use this guide?
Yes, Kathy, thank you so much for the question. I think in order to also, we are going to disseminate this guide as soon as the other languages are finished. We're going to disseminate this guide to the youth, leaders, and also with women with disabilities, and especially with, we're going to try to evaluate this guide with indigenous persons with disabilities in order to know if it's easy for them to understand. If not, we are going to prepare some training also for them regarding this guide, and also for those with disabilities and women, we're going to prepare some small groups that are more interested in accessibility issues in order maybe that these small groups can replicate these trainings with this with the community. And I think the other thing that is very important for me is not only disseminate this guide among persons with disabilities, we need to try to develop some commitments from the stakeholders. That's why, I mean, stakeholders need to be really, to have the knowledge of the accessibility is the only way that we can ensure the fully exercise of the rights of persons with disabilities, but not only persons with disabilities, but also persons with different diversity backgrounds and diversity knowledge. That's why I think it's very important to try to introduce this guide with stakeholders and also with UN agencies, because sometimes we face different difficulties especially when we are running side events with captioning, with international sign language. For instance, it comes to my mind that now we are having a great difficulty with the Generation Equality Forum in Paris, because they are going to use one platform, but this platform is not possible to use captioning. That's why if these stakeholders can have the commitment that accessibility is the only way to fully exercise the rights, they definitely need to change that. That's why this is my commitment, is to to disseminate this not only with persons with disabilities, but also with other stakeholders.
Great, thank you, Rosario. And as we said, it's critical for us that this accessibility guide, as Lourdes has said, it's really speaking across a really holistic approach to include all people of all impairment groups. And it's really about pushing towards universal design, so that the question we had at the very earliest, is there too much of a focus on accessibility? Actually, it's about how we can use that to really bring forward a universal approach that creates environments that all people can thrive in. I'm just going to pass back to Ben, just to say on the way forward for us as CBM Global, we're delighted that this process of working with the DPOs has really pushed us to have an accessibility policy and pushing us to become accountable every day more and more. So that's the way that we're using it. And can I pass over to you, Ben, just to maybe wrap up on how the WBU, because we had a question that came in on how the WBU are using this to move forward with their work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the guide allows for using it in very different ways, and I think the key points has been for us is that the guide has really supported our multi-stakeholder partnership approach. And Rosario was just talking about like I would say the critical importance of engaging with mainstream organization, because ultimately, if we want to make accessibility a reality, we need to be able to mainstream accessibility in disaster risk reduction. We need to be able to mainstream accessibility in climate action, in the design of our cities, villages, and towns. And I think we had the webinar yesterday with some of our partners, including UN Habitat, which is the United Agencies responsible for urban development, cities and settlements around the world. And the Accessibility Go has just been such a critical tool to actually frame our discussion around accessibility, ensuring that we have the same understanding, ensuring that we can now realize, accessibility as a collective good. That's not something as separate. It's not something that should just sit under the responsibility of the Department of Social Affairs in a city. It's actually the responsibility of everyone, those who are procuring goods, the one who are developing program, the one in charge of transportation, the one in charge of building permits. And really the Accessibility Go has allowed that dialogue to happen. And I think without dialogue, there is no way we can meet all the criteria we've been discussing today, and dialogue requires diversity, so we need to engage everyone. And also, this has allowed to really shift the dialogue, around like how do we walk the talk on universal design. And World and Union has been doing so much work around universal design and accessibility that the guide helps building on those advocacy efforts and basically complement them and strengthen them and ensure that we can position World Brand Union and our partners, organization, persons with disabilities as the key resource. It's really a shift of paradigm. It's not being just recipients.
So Ben, I just think the translation might be in the wrong channel. I think the Spanish translation, which says you're entering, is actually in the English channel. So I think a lot of people are confused that they're hearing Spanish rather than hearing you, Ben.
Sorry, but if I may conclude in Spanish or English, I don't know. Just to say that, the idea is really to be at the forefront of the work on accessibility, and that's what the guide is helping us to achieve.
Absolutely. And it's here to make sure that we can walk the talk and that everybody is accountable. And it's been a pleasure that so many of you have asked for the guide, and we would really welcome anybody that would like to partner with us and support us. It's open for everybody to use. It's an open, accessible, free resource. That was one of the questions that came in. We're very happy for people to use it on their own. We're happy if you'd like to come back and let us share your journey, or you'd like to join in our community of practice. We're trying to link and build a strong network. So thank you all. Thanks, Ben. And thank you to ONCE, the World Blind Union, and ICEVI for making sure there's this great opportunity of sharing and exchanging with a very wide network.
Absolutely. And a big thank you to our speakers and participants for attending the event.
Thank you all.